Hi, I'm Alyssa from Alyssa Threads, and today we are going to be sewing the August dress. I designed this pattern with versatility in mind. That is why there are so many glorious views. You could wear this in the winter with tights, and you can do lots of layering. I have layered a sweater over mine. I've done a vest. And then if you want to wear this during warmer months, like in the spring and summer, I also have a sleeveless option as well. This pattern can take you through every season of the year, which is exactly what we want, because if I'm gonna spend the time making a dress, I really wanna get some good wear out of it. In this tutorial, I'm gonna show you guys how to sew this oversized ruffle collar of my dreams. I'm also gonna show you how to sew these really cute sleeves that have this sleeve band on it. And then I'm also going to show you how to sew pockets, because it's not a good dress unless it has pockets. If you're watching this and you're like, I want to sew the sleeveless option, or I want to sew the flounce collar, or I want to sew just the top with the peplum, that is a different video that I will link down below. I have a tutorial for every single version of the August dress slash top. And I am walking you through every single step, so don't worry about it. I promise I will not lead you astray. I got your back. I know how daunting sewing can be. Okay, now let's get started. I'm gonna tell you everything that you need. I'm gonna show you how to gather your fabric. I'm gonna show you how to apply interfacing. Also gonna show you how to sew pockets. There is just so much knowledge in this tutorial, and I hope that you love this pattern as much as I do, and that you wear it for so many years to come. Okay, let the fun begin. Let's go get started on sewing the August dress. Okay, today we're gonna be sewing the August dress. And if you're a little confused on what pattern pieces you're gonna need, I have this overview that will show you what pieces you're gonna need. So if you're sewing the oversized collar, these are the pieces you're gonna need here. If you're sewing the long sleeve, these are the pieces you're gonna need, and then for the sleeveless, and then for the collar flounce. Okay, in order to sew the August dress, you're gonna need the front, back, you're gonna need front and back facing pieces, then you're also gonna need the long sleeve, then you'll also need the ties, the pockets, the oversized collar, this is the ruffle, and then you'll need the sleeve band. So for step one, we are going to add interfacing to our facing pieces and our sleeve band. So interfacing is this piece of fabric that has these little glue dots on one side, and then it's nice and soft on this side, and this helps to stabilize your fabrics. How you're going to do is you're going to take your piece of fabric and you're going to lay it with the wrong side facing up, and then you want the glue dots facing down, and then you just want to give it a little spritz, and then use a piece of scrap fabric to lay here, and then you're just going to press it, give it a few seconds. Okay, then once it's nice and pressed, you're going to see that the interfacing is nice and glued to the back. So you're going to do that on both of your sleeve bands and your front and back facing. Okay, now we're going to take your facing pieces and we are going to sew these together. And then I like to press the seam allowance toward the back facing. And then once we sew these together, I'm going to go ahead and finish the raw edges all the way around. Okay, our facing pieces are sewn together. And if you don't have a serger, you can just zigzag stitch all the way around using your sewing machine. And this just prevents the fabrics from fraying on the outer edge. Now we're gonna set this aside and we're gonna work on our bodice. Okay, the very first step we wanna do for our front and back dress pieces, we want to stay stitch the necklines. You see how this is cut on a curve? And it stretches a little easier. We do not want that to stretch as we're sewing the neckline. To prevent that from stretching, we just want to sew a long straight stitch around the neckline. We're going to do this on the front and the back of the neckline. It's a little hard to see because I'm using white thread, but my stay stitch lines are right along the neckline. The reason we do a really long stitch is because all we have to do is pull this thread and it will come right out when we're done sewing the collar. Now we're gonna sew the darts on the front, and if you've never sewn a dart before, I promise you it's not as scary as it sounds. So on the wrong side of your dress where we marked these little triangles, we are gonna take those And I'm gonna show you a little trick. You just take your pin straight across and pin it from one side to the other. So start on this line, go to the next one, start on this line, go to the next one, and then you kind of just squeeze these pins together and it lines up and matches perfectly. And then I just take a pin, I'm going to take these and push it so that the right sides of the fabric are together. And you're going to see this is going to line up nice and perfect on this side. And then we're just going to do the same thing on the other side. Okay, and then you squeeze those together and they match up perfectly. And then I'm just going to take my pins and resituate them so that they're still lining up. Okay, now we're going to take our darts over to the sewing machine. Sewing our dart is actually so easy. Once you start sewing at the raw edge of the dart, you just want to start a little bit, back stitch. We just want to sew straight down off the fabric, and you do not want to back stitch once you get to the end. So just sew straight off, and then I like to leave these threads a couple of inches long because we are going to take these and we are going to tie them in a knot. I like to double knot them, and we're just going to take it and knot it. Make sure it's not too tight. Do not pull on that fabric because we want this dart to be nice and sharp. Once your dart is sewn, I like to press mine down toward the bottom of the dress, and then where we made that knot at the very tip of the dart, I am just going to trim this down, but make sure you don't cut it too close because we don't want to mess up our dart that we just perfectly sewed. And now I'm going to set this aside while we grab the pockets. Okay, here are my 4 pocket pieces. I'm going to take these over to my serger and I'm going to overlock the outer edge of them. If you don't have a serger, you can go ahead and use a zigzag stitch all the way around. Now we're going to take our pocket pieces and we are going to sew them to the sides of our dress. I have my little markings here. They're kind of hard to see on this fabric, but I also cut a little notch into the side so that you can see where I'm lining it up. And I'm lining it up with the notches on the pocket pieces. And you want to do this right sides together. Obviously on this fabric, you can't see which side is right or wrong. But if you had a printed fabric, you would want the right side of your pocket fabric to be on the right side of your dress fabric. And then we're going to take this over to the sewing machine and we are going to sew this 1/4 of an inch all the way down for all 4 pocket pieces on the front and the back. Okay, once I sewed my pockets, I went ahead and overlocked the entire edge of my dress on both sides of the front and back. And then you want to take your pocket with your seam allowance facing out. You want to press your pocket away from your fabric. And then we're going to take this back over to our sewing machine and we are going to sew an edge stitch, which is 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so you want to bring your pocket right under here. And the way that I do this is I like to line up the edge of my pocket with the inner part of my presser foot. And then we're just going to sew a straight line all the way down. So you are sewing your pocket to your seam allowance. And this is what each pocket is going to look like. You can see that we've stitched all the way down on our pocket and that stitch goes through the seam allowance on the back. So it's securing it to that seam allowance. Okay, once you've got the pockets all sewn, here is where our dress starts to look like a dress. We are going to take our front and back pieces and we are gonna sew them together at the shoulder seams. So I'm gonna pin these together. Okay, I'm gonna take this over to the sewing machine and I'm gonna sew this at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then I'm gonna overlock my raw edges and then press the seam allowance toward the back of the dress. Okay, with our shoulder seams sewn and pressed, now we are gonna work on the side seams and the pockets. When we're sewing our side seams, we are gonna sew straight down to this first notch right here. I am gonna draw it so that you can see it a little better. And then we're gonna stop, back stitch right there, and then we're gonna start at our other notch here, and we're gonna sew straight down, making sure to back stitch at each mark. And then I'll show you how to sew the pockets. I sewed from the top of the seam down to this notch, and then I sewed from this notch down to the bottom. Now we are gonna take our pocket pieces and make sure they're pinned together. And we're gonna sew our pocket starting from just above that notch all the way around to the other side, just below this notch. Okay, then once you press all of your seams nice and flat, you have the perfect pocket. Now go ahead and repeat that on the other side, and seriously pat yourself on the back, because sewing pockets was always the hardest thing for me, and now they're not so scary, and I love adding pockets to everything that I sew. We're setting the bodice aside now, and if you want, this is the perfect time to try it on and see how everything's fitting. And if you need to make any adjustments, you can go ahead and do that now. Now we're gonna sew the ties, and we are gonna sew these with right sides together. And we are gonna sew these ties at 1/4 of an inch. We're gonna start at this folded edge, sew across, and then pivot and sew it all the way down off of the end. And we wanna leave this end open because we're gonna turn this tie right side out. So you're gonna do the same thing with your other one. Okay, once we have the ties sewn, then I like to just clip off the corners here so that they're nice and pointy. Make sure you don't cut your stitches, because that would be just so sad to have to cut and redo everything. Okay, then I'm gonna take this. I have no idea where I got this, but you're gonna take something like a chopstick or a skewer, anything that you can push the end of this tie all the way through. Okay, and then once I get to the end, I like to push out the corners and then pull it all the way through. Okay, and then I'm gonna go press these flat. Okay, where we have these little markings that are kind of squared off, this is gonna indicate where our ties start and then where our collar starts. You wanna pin this like going away from the center front, that way. And then same with our other one, right under there. Okay, and then you are gonna go stay stitch these little ties in place. Okay, once we stay stitch those in place, we're gonna get started on our collar, and we are gonna take these 2 really long pieces and we are going to sew them together with right sides together, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I press this seam allowance flat. We wanna take our collar piece and we are gonna fold this with wrong sides together all the way across this entire ruffle. And before we sew anything, we are gonna take this over to the iron and we're gonna press this flat. Okay, now that we have this collar piece pressed nice and flat, we are gonna sew a gather stitch all the way across the raw edge of this ruffle. And to sew a gather stitch, all you have to do is turn your stitch length to the highest setting. Mine is 4, and then I like to turn the tension all the way up, and I think mine is 9. And then it just makes the perfect gather stitch. You can do 2 rows or you can do 1. I am a little lazy and I only do 1 row, but however many rows you want to do is totally up to you. Okay, then we're gonna take our ruffle piece and we are gonna pin it to our collar, our oversized collar. And the way I like to do that is I like to find the center back of the collar and then line it up with the center seam of the ruffle. And this just helps me get a better idea. And then I like to like roughly pin it here. So I know that I need to gather it a few more inches to make sure it hits this marking that we have. Okay, once we have this ruffle pinned all the way around, we are gonna go back to our sewing machine with that stay stitch again, and we are gonna stay stitch this ruffle all the way around. Okay, now we're taking our other oversized collar piece and we are gonna pin this with right sides together so the ruffle is sandwiched in between these two pieces. We are gonna pin this all the way around on the outer edge. And we're gonna sew this all the way around at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure you're not sewing this neck piece here because we need to turn this right side out. And if that is sewn, then we have no way to turn it right side out. So go ahead and pin it and stitch it all the way around on the outer part. Okay, now that we've sewn everything all the way around, I like to trim my seam allowance super short so that the curves lay nice and flat. But you could also just like clip little triangles into your curved pieces without cutting into the seam allowance. And then you want to take your collar and turn it right side out, and it looks so cute. So I have all of these little threads because I'm sewing linen and it tends to fray a lot as you're like handling it. So I'm gonna go snip all of those off, and then I'm also gonna press my collar flat. Now I've pressed everything nice and flat. If you want, you could go ahead and top stitch all the way around the seam allowance where the collar is, or you could sew just like you could do an understitch where you would sew your seam allowance just to one side of the fabric. So this side is free. You would do that on the wrong side, or you could just leave it as is like I'm gonna do. This is also a really great time to pull out that stay stitch that we sewed onto the ruffle there. I like to cut all the loose threads and everything at the end, but you can do it whenever you like. Okay, now we are going to add our collar to the neckline of our dress. This isn't in the instructions, but I always just like to find the center back and start there just so that I know everything is nice and even. And then I like to find the center back of the collar. Add a little pin to that. And then we're gonna pin the collar to the neckline, right side out. And then you can see where we have our little marking here that we made earlier. And we're gonna start the collar right there. So there is going to be this squared off area at the corner of the collar, and I'm going to show you how we're going to sew that later. That's really going to help us when we're sewing the facing in. Okay, now I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna stay stitch the collar all the way around. And I know we're doing a lot of stay stitching, and that part I promise you really don't wanna skip because it takes a lot of work to sew a garment, and that just helps everything stay together so that you're not making any little mistakes. And I know it's so time consuming, and there are so many times where I'm like, I'm just gonna skip this step, and then I super regret it later. So I promise you, I'm not wasting your time. That is just really that important. So I'm gonna go stay stitch this all the way around the neckline. Now, there's lots of threads everywhere from the stay stitching, but leaving those will help pull them out really easily later. Now we're gonna sew the facing to the collar all the way around. But before I get started on that, I wanna add a little dot to my facing at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, just at the center front right here. And that's gonna help us get a super pointy front part of the facing once we get to sewing that part. So now we're gonna take our facing with right sides together and we're gonna pin it all the way around our entire neckline. And for this part, you wanna make sure that the collar is pulled away and so are the ties. You really don't wanna sew over these as we're sewing the facing. So just be sure that those aren't in there, and you can kind of fill it through here if it feels too bulky. And then I like to match my shoulder seams here. Okay, so here's how it looks once we have our facing pinned all the way around. You can see that my collar pieces aren't stuck in there and my tie pieces are hanging out of the edge. Same on this side, everything is all detached. Now I'm gonna show you as I'm sewing how I sew this corner right here. But if you wanna mark it again, just to square it off, this is gonna help us as we're sewing this corner here. You can see that this is where the collar piece is, and then where the tie is here. And then you can go ahead and square that off. And I'll show you how to sew around those so that we don't get anything caught. When we're sewing the facing, I like to start on the seam. So this is the front of the facing and this is back. And where we stitch them together, that's where I like to start. It just gives me a good start and stop point. So I'm just gonna follow it all the way around until I get to the first front corner. Once I get to this first corner of my facing, okay, you can see where I sewed up to the marking parts that are squared off. Now I just want to walk my stitch very slowly, and I just want to make sure it's not on my collar piece right there. Then I'm going to leave my needle down. I'm going to leave my needle down in my fabric, and then I'm going to raise my presser foot, and I'm going to turn my work. And I'm going to place it back down, still making sure the ruffle of the collar isn't getting stuck anywhere. And then I'm going to sew straight down to the center front. As I'm sewing to the center front, I want to sew to that marking that we made before. And I want to leave my needle down. Then I'm going to raise my presser foot. Oh, we lost a pin. Turn my work, and then I want to continue sewing all the way back up my facing. Okay, and then as you come back up to that marking, the squared off part that we did before, I like to walk my presser foot up. And then I turn my work, leaving my needle down, put my presser foot back down, and then continue to sew. And then I've met back up with that shoulder seam. Okay, now that we have finished sewing our facing, now we're gonna snip the pointy edges. And you wanna be really careful on this to make sure you're not cutting your stitching. You just want to cut it. You want to cut straight down the center front right here, making sure you don't cut that stitch. And then for the rest of the neckline, you just want to clip curves in your seam allowance without clipping the stitches, just like you did with the collar. Okay, I pressed the facing to the inside and went ahead and pressed this all the way around. Now we're gonna take this back to the sewing machine and we are gonna understitch. And to understitch, you are gonna pull your facing away from your bodice along with the seam allowance underneath, and you're gonna stitch all the way around your collar as far as you can go. So I'm gonna stitch all the way around and I'm gonna stop somewhere here, and then I'm gonna pick it up back here, go all the way down, all the way back up, stop, and then finish sewing all the way around. And make sure as you're sewing, you're catching the seam allowance underneath and you're sewing it to the facing. So when you get back to the front, this is where you won't be able to sew completely in this corner. So I get as close as I can, and then I'll just back stitch and then start again as I go down. And this is where I was sewing here, and now I'm gonna start about here. And I'm making sure that the seam allowance is pressed out towards the facing. So here is the ruffle collar here, and then here is the facing that we just understitch with the seam allowance going there. Before I finish the facing completely, one more thing that I like to do before I move on, I like to understitch the facing in place. So the way that I do that is I move the collar out of my way, and you can see the shoulder seam here and the facing underneath here. I like to pin this to the shoulder seam out here, and then I'll put this back through the sewing machine and stitch in the ditch so that the facing is held in place and it's not moving around anywhere. And then I'm gonna take it to my sewing machine, and you can definitely feel where that facing is right here, so you know where to start and finish. And then I'm lining up the center of my presser foot here with the shoulder seam here. And I'm just making sure my needle is hitting in that shoulder seam stitch. And then I'm just gonna sew a straight stitch, making sure I back stitch. And then I'm gonna stop just before I get to the collar because I wanna make sure I'm not sewing through the collar. Okay, after you finish stitching in the ditch, here's how the facing looks from the inside, so it is not going anywhere. Okay, now we're gonna take our sleeve bands and we are gonna fold these in half. And when we're doing this, this is just to give us a good crease that is really like a guide as we're sewing the sleeve bands. So we're gonna go ahead and fold it in half and then press it. Okay, and then once we have it folded in half, then we're gonna fold one side 3/8 of an inch. Okay, once you have your creases all pressed, then you're gonna sew your sleeve bands with right sides together down the edge at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, once these are all sewn together, we are just gonna set these aside while we sew our sleeves. Okay, we're gonna sew a gather stitch in between our notches here and here. Okay, once we've sewn that gather stitch across the top, then we're just gonna take our sleeves and we're gonna sew the sides together at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then I'm gonna overlock mine once I'm done with that. And then I'm gonna press the seam allowance toward the back of the sleeve. Okay, now at the bottom of our sleeve, we're gonna sew a gather stitch all the way around. Okay, now we're gonna take our sleeve bands, and where we made that first crease, we are gonna pin the opposite side, so where there's no crease, to the sleeve. So we're gonna take our sleeve band where this seam is and where the underarm seam is here. I like to pin those together. And then on the other side of your sleeve band where you made this notch earlier, we're gonna find where that is on the sleeve here, and we are gonna pin those together. Just skips that extra step of guessing if the gathers are even, and I found that if you do it this way, it just makes it so they're all nice and even. And then if you need to adjust your gathers, you just pull on your thread within those center marking. Okay, once this sleeve band is pinned all the way around, then we're gonna sew this 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then I'll show you why we made these creases earlier, because this just makes sewing the sleeve band so much easier when you have these little like guides. Okay, I sewed my sleeve band to my sleeve. I pressed the seam allowance down toward the bottom of the sleeve band. Now what you want to do here, and this is why we pressed this crease earlier, you want to turn this crease under so that these two are facing together. And then where we made that center crease here, you want to fold it under again on that center crease. And you're going to find that this top crease lays just above the stitch line here, which is exactly what we want it to do. So on the right side, I like to pin this all the way around, making sure that I'm catching the inside of the sleeve band. And I like to go all the way around. So I fold it up just above that stitch line. And then I'm pinning it. Do it again. And this is what it looks like on the right side of the sleeve. Now we're gonna take this over to the sewing machine, and earlier I showed you how to stitch in the ditch. Now we're gonna do that with the sleeve, and we're gonna take this over to the sewing machine and we're gonna stitch in the ditch all the way around. So as you're sewing through this ditch, which is the seam line, you're actually catching the back of this fabric so that it's making that cute little sleeve band. And we're gonna line up the presser foot center right there, just on top of the ditch, which is that seam where it's sewn together. Okay, and then once you get back to your stitch here, just go ahead and back stitch. Okay, once you're done sewing the sleeve, this is how it's gonna look. So this is the wrong side of the sleeve, and you can see that it stitches along this side as you're sewing in the ditch on this side. And if you're using a perfectly matching thread, you're not even gonna be able to see this at all. Now go ahead and do the same thing on your other sleeve. Okay, let's sew our sleeves to our dress now. Okay, now we're gonna take our sleeve, and I like to pin the underarm seams together first, and then I'll walk it around and then pin our notches together. So the one notch is for the front, and then the part that has two notches is the back of the sleeve. So we'll pin those together. Okay, and then when I get to this gathered sleeve up here where this center notch is, I like to line that up with the shoulder seam. And then I'm gonna go over to my thread right here that I gather. You could do this before, but this is just the way that I like to do it because it makes it so that the gathers are really even. And then I'm just gonna gather within those pins. Okay, and then I'm gonna go sew this sleeve at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then I'm gonna overlock it as well. Okay, our sleeves are all sewn on and they look perfect. They have a little bit of gather up at the top to make them nice and poofy, and our sleeve band is just so stunning. Now we are gonna work on the hem of our dress. Now the way I'm gonna do this, I overlocked the edge and then I'm gonna edge stitch all the way around. If you're doing a double fold hem, then you're gonna fold this 1/4 of an inch, press it all the way around, and then fold it again at 1/2 an inch. And then you're gonna edge stitch all the way around, and that will fully enclose the raw hem. But because I'm using my serger, I'm just gonna go ahead and finish my hem this way and stitch all the way around. And then once you finish the hem, you are all finished. Try it on, pull all of your stay stitches out, cut off any loose threads, and that's it. You sewed your August dress with the poofiest sleeves and the most delicious collar. Pat yourself on the back because we did a lot of gathering and stay stitching, but I promise you it is so worth it. Go ahead and give it a try on. Okay, here is how the dress turned out. It is so cute. Mind you, your dress will not be this short. I am a lover of hoochie hems, which means I just really love a short dress. So I took 3 inches off of mine. Yours will be a little longer, like down to your knees. Please do not come for me for wearing my shoes in the house. I'm just showing you to get the full effect of the outfit. I love these big sleeves and the oversized collar is just so cute. Okay, thank you so much for watching. If this tutorial was super helpful for you, let me know. If there's anything that you have questions about, be sure to leave a comment and I'll get back to you super quickly. I hope you love your August dress as much as I do. And don't forget to follow me on all of my social media platforms at Alyssa Threads.